Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the RSE. Thank you for coming along to the McCormick Lecture 24-25. I'm going to do a few introductions. First of all, let me introduce myself, Mona Siddiqui. I'm a professor of Islamic and Interreligious Studies at the University of Edinburgh, and in my capacity today as VP International at the Royal Society of Edinburgh. I won't be VP International for much longer as my term comes to an end, but I'd just like to take this opportunity to say how delighted I am to be hosting and chairing this lecture. Just so that you know, there is an online, this is being live streamed, is that correct? This is also being live streamed, and we also have an online audience. A little bit of housekeeping first. Please note that the RSE's fire safety and evacuation procedure is to assemble outside the dome, leaving the building the same way you came in. The fire exit routes are on the current slide. Okay, there they are. But please follow the RSE staff who are at the back, and they will show you, in case there is a need for an evacuation, where to go. We're not expecting a fire alarm, but the RSE staff will be on hand. Just before I introduce our speaker today, just a little bit about the lecture itself. Each year, the RSE invites a prominent figure to deliver a speech on a matter of international importance, known as the RSE McCormick event. The event is named in honor of Professor Sir Neil McCormick, FRSE, in recognition of his huge contribution to Scottish and European politics, and in particular, his international work for the RSE. And I am particularly pleased to be welcoming Lady Flora McCormick and their daughter Ailsa. Thank you very much for joining us. All are welcome, as you know, to the RSE's signature events designed to educate and encourage new thinking, ideas, and conversation. And these events aim to amplify the RSE's mission of making knowledge made useful by enhancing our understanding of national and global scientific, cultural, and economic topics. You are all in for a fantastic evening. I'm not going to say too much about David because I want you all to have the benefit of listening to his lecture, but David Pratt is known to most of us, if not all of us, as a journalist, photographer, broadcaster, and author, and for his numerous appearances in local, national, and international media. And David's lecture today is what? What is David's lecture today? Why can't I see it? Well, David, you'll have to introduce your own lecture. So I can't see my notes. But David will speak for about 40-45 minutes, and there will be some slides as well. Just to let you know, the lecture is about war and conflict, so there may be one or two distressing images, but just be aware of that. And then there will be plenty of time for a Q&A. I would urge you to keep your phone on silent, not to ask any questions during the lecture, not to interrupt during the lecture. You'll have plenty of time afterwards when he's finished his lecture. So please join me in thanking David, first of all, for agreeing to do the lecture and for presenting the 24-25 McCormick Lecture. David Pratt.
Thank you, Professor Siddiqui. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and what a pleasure to see so many familiar faces here tonight. I'm especially pleased that Lady McCormick and her daughter Ailsa can be with us this evening, so it's been a pleasure to meet you both. It's a huge privilege to be invited to speak at a lecture named for Professor McCormick, a man whose contribution to the political and intellectual discourse of this nation, of Scotland and the European continent, was, to say the least, exceptional. What, I wonder, would Sir Neil McCormick, were he witness today to the troubled times in which we live, have made of the biggest conflict to rack Europe since the Second World War? I'm speaking, of course, about the more than 3 years of fighting that has ensued since Russia's invasion of Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022. It's that role of bearing personal and professional witness to these turbulent times in Europe that I want to address in this evening's lecture. 13 years ago, my friend and colleague, the BBC journalist Alan Little, stood right here delivering his own McCormick lecture on how Europe's history influences its political present. My goodness, looking back now, how almost near prophetic Alan's observations were given events of recent years in Ukraine. But Alan, in his opening remarks, also made what he described as a full disclosure. I'm no scholar, he confessed. I'm an itinerant reporter, an eyewitness, and a teller of tales. I'm a storyteller. Ditto. For I, too, am a storyteller, not a scholar. I'm what we know in the industry as a words and pictures man, as it's known in journalism. And it's by using those words and pictures tonight that I hope to provide you with a reflective insight into what it means to be a journalist covering conflict in Europe today. In doing so, I want to argue that just as the nature of warfare has in some ways changed, so too has how we cover it as reporters. I want to show just what that coverage involves from the ground level up. Like many of my journalistic colleagues, I often feel a tremendous sense of frustration at the lack of understanding among news consumers of the physical, ethical, political and technological challenges that reporters face to provide insights from the front lines of Ukraine and elsewhere. Coming home from covering any war is a dislocating experience for a reporter. I know I'll never get used to that peculiar feeling of witnessing people in extremis one moment, then sitting a few days later in a restaurant or pub at home chatting with friends. War distorts everything, and time, distance, and state of mind are no exceptions. My own sense of dislocation, of course, is nothing compared to that experienced by countless Ukrainians and indeed Russians right now. And it's with the Ukrainian people's direct experience that I would like to begin by way of reminding us all here this evening of what the cost of this war really means for them. For to me, as a reporter, I've always felt it vital to keep the human dimension to the fore. Too often it's easy to become distracted by the big geopolitical or strategic considerations. Important as these obviously are, war for most people caught up in its terrible throes is much more prosaic or unimaginably painful. To move on to the first image. So, I want to take you back to a chilly spring morning in the western Ukrainian city of Lviv, barely days after the Russian invasion. I was on my way to Kyiv to try to get there before Russian troops were already on the city's outskirts. I'd spent the night in Lviv and the following morning found myself on the street outside the ancient sort of Baroque St. Peter and Paul Garrison Church in the heart of the city. There I watched as mourners began to line up either side of the pavement, as you can see in this photograph. Among them were elderly women, headscarfed and bowed with age, some of a generation old enough to remember wars and oppression of the past that have gripped this part of Europe. Flanked by the mourners, as you can see, was a young woman called Tanya, baby daughter in her arms, and she knelt on the cobbles as a military pallbearer slowly carried her husband's coffin into the adjacent basilica. Later, I would watch as it was laid to rest in Lviv's Lychakiv cemetery, the most famous cemetery in Ukraine that is now all but filled to capacity with those that have fallen since the war began. But it was far from Lviv, however, in the eastern Ukrainian town of Lyman that sits in the Donetsk region, that on March the 14th, 2022, 32-year-old Volodymyr Rurak was killed in action. Unlike many young Ukrainian men and women recently thrust into the unexpected maelstrom of frontline duty against the Russian invaders of their city, Volodymyr was no stranger to battle. He had been a soldier since 2018 and was even given a presidential award for his bravery and service fighting in the eastern Donbass region against pro-Russian separatist forces there. On his social media account, I later came across a picture of Volodymyr in a snowy landscape wearing white winter camouflage clothing and cradling a Kalashnikov assault rifle. It's an image in stark contrast with another that I found on social media of a suited, bow-tied, flower-wearing figure, and much happier man giving a loving kiss to his bride Tanya, a local Lviv council worker, when they married in 2020. But those early pictures from the Donbass of Volodymyr on the front lines were a sobering reminder to me that while at that moment the world had just then been jolted into the shocking realization of Russia's recent invasion, Ukraine's war had been raging for some time long before that. In fact, my own experience with Ukraine's conflict, like Volodymyr Rurak, was also in the Donetsk region, Donetsk city to be precise. It was there during April 2014 that pro-Russian separatists had begun storming government buildings and seizing weapons. Back then, just off Pushkin Boulevard in the heart of the city, the separatists had occupied the city hall and had already hoisted Soviet-era banners before myself and other correspondents had arrived in Donetsk. Every day the barricades grew higher and more heavily manned. The young men who manned these barricades had a kind of menacing swagger, as you can see from this photograph, wearing ski masks and wielding clubs or iron bars. They patrolled the surrounding streets almost as if they were looking for a fight. Many reminded me of other young men I had seen years before in another of Europe's wars, in the Balkans, as the former Yugoslavia tore itself apart along ethnic, nationalist and religious lines. Kitted out in their crash helmets, their tracksuits and protective knee and arm pads, they were ready for action, and they cut a very different dash from their elderly pro-Russian comrades and old communists who ambled about the barricades wearing black caps and Red Star lapel badges. Quite often on those barricades, the words of a song blared out from the loudspeakers, appealing for help from Moscow. Russia, come to us, went the familiar refrain. One of those that I met on the barricades, hoping for the Russians to come, was an 18-year-old man called Konstantin. We're normal people who struggle for our rights. We're not terrorists, as the Kiev government say. Konstantin was at pains to reassure me. But what if the Ukrainian army comes with tanks and infantry, I asked him. Then we'll fight and use these, Konstantin replied, nodding in the direction of a crate of beer bottles converted into Molotov cocktail petrol bombs. With hindsight, of course, Konstantin and his fellow separatists need not have worried about their limited arsenal at that point in time. Moscow, in the months ahead, would see to that. For as if answering the call of that song that played endlessly from the barricades' loudspeakers, Russia, as we know, did indeed come, complete with tanks, rocket launchers, men and materiel, drones, warships, and hypersonic missiles. When I look back now, those early days in Donetsk, like so many moments reporting war, were actually quite surreal. I mean, one moment I would be having a lunchtime borscht, which is a kind of soup, or evening beer with my Ukrainian translator and fixer, who has since become a great friend. The next, we would find ourselves tentatively navigating the increasingly volatile street politics that were inexorably dragging eastern Ukraine towards a Russian invasion and the all-out conflict that we have today and that is dividing the world. Few, I think, at that time could have foreseen what was to follow. It was much the same story back in Europe of 1938, of course, when few then seemed to realise what would follow Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and his French counterpart's agreement to Hitler's demands for Czechoslovakia to cede a portion of its territory known as the Sudetenland to Germany. In return, Adolf Hitler, of course, assured the Western Allies that he had no further territorial ambitions. If all this sounds familiar, then there's good reason for that, and it's obvious, given that Vladimir Putin in 2014-2015 said much the same thing, assuring Ukraine and its allies that things would stop with the Donbass. If there's one thing perhaps I've learned in going on 40 years of covering the world's conflicts, it's this. In short, far removed as we might think we are from the repercussions of global goings-on, those dark murmurings, be they in the deserts and mountains of Iraq and Afghanistan, or in the corridors of power in Moscow, or back streets of Donetsk, can and do ultimately impact on all our lives. The reporter's role then, among other things, is to make sense of those murmurings, make us aware of their significance, and above all, to bear witness to their consequences. In one sense, I suppose, the war correspondent's job today, in today's wartime Europe, remains primarily what it has always been, to make distant and seemingly impenetrable events meaningful, to interpret parts of a dangerous world in a way we can all understand. Without war correspondents, there would be no independent eyes and ears, and our existence would be reduced to the scale of almost some medieval village, preoccupied only with the concerns of self, family, and neighbours. And as today's war in Ukraine and elsewhere becomes a more remote, mechanised activity, dispatches and images from right there on the ground have significant value. When a trigger gets pulled, or a bomb explodes, real people are often on the wrong end of it, and bearing witness to the consequences gives meaning to what we see. It was early one morning in the summer of 2023, in a single step, that the horrendous reality of those consequences of war were brought home to a young man I shall simply call Stanislav. One moment, Stanislav was running forward under fire, throwing grenades into Russian trenches. The next, he was lying sprawled on his back, looking at a left leg he described to me as resembling a pizza with a base that was bone. Stanislav remained fully conscious, he told me, speaking of those split seconds that morning on the war's eastern front line at Andriivka, after stepping on the landmine that ripped off his left leg. Today, he actually, would you believe, counts this wound as lucky because it happened below the knee, making later rehabilitation much, much easier. When I met Stanislav in the physiotherapy room of the Rehabilitation and Prosthetic Center in Kiev, it's called Bez Obmezen, forgive my pronunciation, but it translates basically as without limits. So it gives you an idea of the aspirations of those that go through that place, and they believe that they can get back literally to moving and rehabilitate themselves. But again, when I spoke with him, I was reminded, not for the first time, of how potentially intrusive war reporting can be. It's only with the generosity and openness of those caught up in the most traumatic moments of their lives is it possible to tell their stories, something every good reporter must surely understand and acknowledge. On the shelves of my study at home sit rows of identical little black pocket notebooks. There must be scores of them. I don't know how many I've got. And in the first facing page of each book is written the name of a place and a date. Libya, 2011. Somalia, 2013. Afghanistan, 2009. Iraq, 2016. Ukraine, 2022. And so the places and dates go on. I've never got around to organising these notebooks chronologically, so plucking one out at random means sometimes lurching back into the past or fast-forwarding to the present. In all these notebooks, though, in every single one of them, the words have almost always been written up hastily. Mostly they comprise names, ages, and descriptions of people, places and incidents, the details and raw material that every reporter needs for writing up a story. They're almost like shards of pottery dug up from some archaeological excavation, if you can imagine that. In themselves, they're only fragments. But when they're brought together, they shape a more rounded picture of the lives of those people I've met during my time as a correspondent. Just randomly going through those Ukrainian notebooks recently, I paused at Stanislav's story. Likewise, I found myself pondering another particular entry. It detailed the account of a 36-year-old Ukrainian mother, Natalia Kovalchuk, and her 5-year-old daughter, Ilyana. Just after the Russian invasion had been stalled in March 22, I met Natalia and Ilyana in the devastated city of Borodyanka. Both were living in a small flat, the family's own home, being uninhabitable after shells, rockets, and airstrikes ripped swathes of Borodyanka apart. In the heart of the city lies a central square in which sits a monument to the great 19th century Ukrainian poet and patriot Taras Shevchenko. That day, the giant sculpted head of the poet lay dangling from its plinth, pockmarked with holes from bullets fired by Russian soldiers when they overran Borodyanka. It was there that I asked Natalia about those terrifying moments when war first came to the city. I was here with my family, and when the tanks entered, we hid in the basement and they destroyed our house. It hurts even now to talk about it. Natalia recalled the first of numerous waves of tears during our conversation welling in her eyes. She went on to tell me how, since that day, her husband had then gone to the front line to fight and had been very recently killed. So few of us in the comparative comfort of our own world can fully comprehend the resourcefulness and courage it takes for those like Natalia and her daughter simply to get through another day, surrounded by the impact of a war not of their making. Many years ago, in another European war that I covered in Bosnia, an elderly woman called Safata Kovacevic, who had lost her entire family during the siege of Sarajevo, said some words I'll never forget. They're indelibly etched in my mind. War is an anesthetic, David, she told me. When the guns are firing, we feel nothing. We are numb. It's with peace that we feel pain. Peace, though, in Ukraine remains as elusive as ever. And as long as the war continues, the need for accurate, humane, and insightful coverage of it remains vital. The act of bearing witness, however, a foundation of war reporting, continues to be democratized and disseminated in dramatically new ways. The same phone, the same mobile phone that carries photos of your child's new puppy or hosts aimless video games also serves up news from the front lines almost as it happened, at the snap of a finger. So now that war comes to us in real time, do we feel helpless or empowered? Do we care more, or will the ubiquity of images and information desensitize us to the point where human suffering loses meaning when it's only part of a scroll down that includes a video of some celebrity figure's latest hijinks? For many among today's digital generation, they cannot help, I think, looking simply at such stuff because of what US writer and philosopher Susan Sontag once described as the perennial seductiveness of war. Tune into X, TikTok, Instagram, or other social media platforms, and you'll find a never-ending run of video clips shot from drones, soldiers' head cams, or by citizen journalists that take us to the heart of Ukraine's war. Some, of course, are utilised by activists for their own political ends, which, in an era of fake news and alternative facts, makes the need for professional reporting ever more pressing. As my late colleague Marie Colvin of the Sunday Times, who I sometimes worked alongside before she was killed while reporting in Syria, once put it, the reporter's job is all about finding truth in a sandstorm of propaganda. These truths, be they in Ukraine, Gaza, or elsewhere, especially matter when a cacophony of opinion and ideology threatens to drown out the space reserved for facts. Marie Colvin's belief was also that journalism's role was to shine a spotlight on and give voice to people who have no voice. Much over the years has been made about the so-called journalism of attachment. I don't know if you're familiar with that term. It was a phrase first coined by the genre's unofficial founder, Martin Bell, the former BBC correspondent. It was back in the 1990s, during the conflict in the former Yugoslavia, that Bell made the case for a journalism that cares as well as a journalism that knows. Journalists, said Bell, had a new moral obligation to distinguish between good and evil in conflict zones, and if necessary, to take sides. In other words, it was fine to become emotionally attached and nothing to be professionally afraid of. Now, such thinking was not, as you can imagine, uncontroversial, with many warning that by emphasising attachment over neutrality, emotionalism over objectivity, there were dangers that the reporter would shift into the role of activist or campaigner rather than one step removed dispassionate recorder of fact and truth. Personally, I've often thought such fears were overblown and that a balance can actually be struck. The reporter who makes clear that he or she finds South African apartheid or the methods used by Israeli occupation forces in the Gaza Strip to be unacceptable and abhorrent is doing nothing more than their job. While the journalism of attachment may in the 1990s have seemed new at the time, such attitudes have historically often provided the motivating factor behind some of the best ever journalism that has existed. If you think of Claude Coburn's dispatches from the Spanish Civil War in the 1930s, or John Pilger and Wilfred Burchett's coverage of the Vietnam conflict, or the South African newspaper editors and anti-apartheid activist Donald Woods, you will understand a little bit of what I mean by that. That same digital technology that I mentioned earlier that allows so many of today's news consumers such easy and easily dismissed access does, I'm pleased to say on the plus side, also liberate rather than impede war reporters. Lightweight video cameras have allowed one-person operations to replace cumbersome TV crews. Suddenly camera operators are free to roam in much the same way as their newspaper writer and photographer counterparts have always done. The result has been eyewitness verity pictures such as we have rarely seen before. It gives new meaning to the famous remark by the legendary Second World War photographer Robert Capa that if your pictures aren't good enough, you're not close enough. Photographers, camera operators and writers have also begun to explore new ways of telling the story of war in Europe. While reporters have always, myself included, embedded with the military, these days they're also immersing themselves deep in the civilian hearts of conflicts. They're engaging in long-term projects, producing documentary films, photo essays, and multimedia packages that provide a more intimate insight into life within Ukraine's conflict zones. This photograph was taken in Mykolaiv at a water point in the city when the water supplies had been cut. These war reporters, many of them freelancers or independents, insist on returning time and again to stories long after the headlines have moved on. As experienced journalists who are thoroughly familiar with their beats and not beholden to one organisation, they're able to provide real political and cultural context to the causes and effects of conflict. Many of you here tonight, I'm sure, are familiar with the work of my Scottish friend and journalist colleague Jen Stout, whose wonderful book, Night Train to Odessa, is the product of just that very kind of considered, informed, eyewitness reportage from ground level in Ukraine. But freelancers like Jen and countless others covering the war in Ukraine face myriad challenges and unprecedented threats from various quarters. Some of those challenges and threats are not as immediately obvious as you might think. The cult of personalities, infotainment, changing trends in homes, gardens, holidays, our order of the day, say the media market researchers and bean counters, and even, dare I say it, some editors. This threatens to overwhelm the increasingly limited space allocated for actual real-time reporting. I think it was a remarkable British war photographer Don McCullin, who I'm sure many of you are familiar with his work, who many decades ago, at a time when the Sunday Times was fast becoming more lifestyle-driven in its content, wryly described seeing foreign correspondents, some soon to be out of work, standing around the office in their safari suits with no safari to go to. In more recent years, for those freelancers who currently do the bulk of the on-the-ground reporting from conflict zones, there are a number of reasons cited within an increasingly cost-conscious industry to explain why war reporting at one time appeared to be heading for semi-extinction. Among them were prohibitive life insurance and hostile environment training costs, restrictive access and expensive airfares, just to name a few. For a time, and for some within the managerial and administrative ranks of the news business, there was an increasingly familiar refrain that suggested the end of the war correspondent is indeed nigh. But whenever that refrain was reaching its peak, along would come another conflagration, such as the so-called war on terror after 9/11, or now in Ukraine, and suddenly editors realised that their readers, listeners and viewers wanted to know what was happening, and a rekindled interest in war reporting would instantly take place. There's a pattern there. It happens time and time again. It goes out of fashion, then it's picked up again. But despite this intermittent rise in demand, there's absolutely no denying the challenges facing war reporting brought on by shrinking editorial budgets and the improved technology that helps feed the voracious monster of 24-hour rolling news coverage. It was a veteran BBC correspondent, Michael Burke, who once derisively referred to such reporting as the preserve of rooftop ventriloquism and satellite disc jockeys. For a while, it looked as if this would be the sort of sanitised future for the war reporter, more rooftop analyst than frontline eyewitness. As one veteran television journalist correspondent observed some years ago in response to rolling news coverage, ultimately, there is no journalistic merit at all in being first with a load of boring old rubbish. In the intervening years, I've heard many contemporary broadcast reporters make similar complaints when working in war zones. How can I go and get the story if they want me constantly standing by near a satellite feed point? I can't be in both places, complained one newsman to me in Erbil in northern Iraq shortly after hostilities had broken out there in 2003. The they to whom he was referring, of course, were his editors at their desks back home. The reign of the desk editor is a long-standing bone of contention among some reporters who work in the field. From Kabul to the Congo, war correspondents have grumbled over their nighttime beers about those so-called journalists, some of whom have never done any reporting, never tried to feed the satellite or meet a deadline when there is no electricity, or some Liberian child soldiers and crack cocaine have other ideas about how you can entertain them of an evening. In short, there's nothing like an unsupportive editor to make what is already a hard job even harder. Fortunately, in my own experience, such individuals have been a rarity. But aside from the threat of industry cuts and the ubiquitous presence of online accounts, the veracity of whose journalism leaves much to be desired, there are other very real threats to the journalists today covering conflict in Europe and elsewhere. Russia's war against Ukraine, like other conflicts in the world, such as the one in Gaza, has starkly revealed yet again that journalists do not enjoy basic protection under international humanitarian law. Today's wars consistently demonstrate that far from wearing body armour in which the wearer is clearly identified as press, as my colleagues here are, three of my colleagues that I work with in Ukraine, instead of making them safer, it turns them into targets more often than not. And this too, before those politicians who brand journalists as enemies of the people, who suggest that they are treacherous and happy to betray the country. Now, by doing so, such politicians put reporters in the firing line of increased hatred. Only this month, the Council of Europe partner organisations who monitor journalist safety, among them the International Federation of Journalists, the IFJ, Reporters Without Borders and the Committee to Protect Journalists, the CPJ, published their annual report. And frankly, it made for pretty grim reading. Entitled 2024, Confronting Political Pressure, Disinformation and the Erosion of Media Independence, it identified as serious threats the digital surveillance of journalists and its risks to source confidentiality, the transnational repression of journalists, notably from Russia and Belarus, and the trend towards media capture by governments in some countries. The report warns too of the rising threat of disinformation that I briefly mentioned earlier, including AI-generated content and state propaganda used to manipulate public opinion and undermine independent journalism. In a nutshell, the risks that journalists face covering Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine remain the most pressing concern related to the safety of journalists in Europe throughout 2024. But despite this, and just over 3 years into Russia's full-scale invasion, journalists and media organisations continue their relentless work. As I stand here right now, they're reporting under daily bombardment, documenting war crimes and providing critical information and documentation to both local and international audiences. As the European Centre for Media and Press Freedom, Media and Freedom recently reminded, the war has come at a devastating cost to journalists, especially for our colleagues in the Ukrainian media sector, and on every possible level. There is, of course, a threat to their physical safety. Ukrainian journalists are systematically targeted and imprisoned by Russian forces in occupied territories in Russia itself. They're detained under fabricated charges of espionage, terrorism, or sabotage, often as part of mass arrests or independent media, civil society activists, and Crimean Tatar communities. Many are taken from their homes, workplaces, or even while reporting from the field, with no access to a fair trial or legal defence. In occupied Crimea, journalists accredited or associated with Crimean solidarity and independent initiatives have been accused of affiliations with banned organisations and sentenced to decades in Russian prisons. Others have been incarcerated for exposing war crimes, repression, and human rights abuses. In newly occupied territories, Russian forces detain journalists for reporting on local resistance and independent news. Some are abducted in raids, while others are lured under pretences and forcibly taken away. As European media monitoring organisations have documented, once in captivity, journalists are subjected to torture and ill treatment, forced confessions, and prolonged isolation. Some disappear without a trace, while others endure severe abuse in high-security Russian penal colonies. Others, again, are also pressured to participate in propaganda videos or even staged events to discredit Ukraine and independent media. To date, more than 100 media workers have been killed since the full-scale war began, and currently more than 30 Ukrainian civilian journalists are illegally held in Russian captivity, along with one military journalist taken as a prisoner of war. To put some names and human context to these figures that have been growing continuously since Russia's invasion, there's the case of photojournalist Max Levin, who in April 2022 was found executed near Kiev after going missing in a combat zone. Investigations later confirmed that Russian forces were responsible for his killing. Then there was the Reuters security advisor Ryan Evans, killed in August 2024 in a Russian missile strike on a hotel in Kramatorsk where journalists were staying. That same year in October, Ukrainian journalist Victoria Roshchina, who Russian forces had previously detained, died while being held in Russian captivity shortly before she was supposed to be part of a prisoner exchange. These are just a few examples. On every level, the ongoing war has placed unprecedented psychological strain on Ukrainian journalists, with rising workloads, chronic stress, and limited opportunities for rest and resulting post-traumatic stress disorder. Many journalists too have been mobilised or volunteered for military service, including, I should say, at least 2 camera operators that I have worked with while making 2 BBC documentaries in the country. Even I don't know their whereabouts right now. The war too has compounded the problems that existed before Russia's invasion, that exist in other media landscapes across Europe: budget cuts, cash shortages, a shrinking advertising market, inflation and other financial pressures. And to top it all, along came the Trump administration and its impact on donor support. Earlier this month, President Trump signed an executive order aiming to reduce several federal agencies, including US Agency for Global Media, which oversees Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty. Another US taxpayer-funded broadcasters also suffered. In total, some $260 million allocated by US Congress to support independent media and the free flow of information has been cut in a heartbeat. And the same, of course, extends to the humanitarian sector. In Ukraine, where 9 out of 10 media outlets rely on subsidies and where US aid is the primary donor, it goes without saying that the impact has actually been profound. The dangers, too, are quite obvious, for this lack of sustainable and functioning funding may doom Ukrainian independent media, leaving the country vulnerable to external influence and lack of representation. In short, the back door is open for potentially unscrupulous oligarchs and political players. They may seek to alter the editorial line and independence of these media. Lack of funding too may lead to the closure of high-quality outlets, and the need for others to restart from scratch will erase years of progress and weaken Ukraine's media landscape. It's incredible testimony, I think, to the resilience and dedication of my Ukrainian colleagues that despite these massive challenges, they remain strong and unwavering, and I'm always impressed by that every time I return. Still they report from the front lines, still they break major investigative stories, expose war crimes, corruption, and hold power to account, as all journalism should seek to do. Their Herculean efforts epitomise the reporter's real value. I'm talking here about journalism's greatest capacity, that of helping prevent abuses of power or exposing immoral, unethical, or illegal behaviour by individuals, armies, governments, or companies. Such journalism ensures that those realities and consequences of the war I mentioned at the start of this lecture are not forgotten, and that the human perspective I spoke of remains to the fore. In the hands of such people, the reporter's trade, I think, is something to be proud of. And our support for such work, and indeed for independent journalism across Europe, is paramount. So what can we do? How can we help? Well, we need to ensure that independent journalism is funded. We need also at this crucial time to encourage a media here in Scotland and elsewhere that is not inward-looking or parochial, but has an outward embrace and places the value on international or foreign affairs reporting that we once did without question. As for Ukraine itself, we must ensure that Ukrainian as well as their international colleagues are heard. Their expertise is crucial in shaping an accurate global narrative. Alongside this, there is a need to strengthen media partnerships through through reporting organisations and NGOs, ensuring resilience and independence. But above all, we must advocate for press freedom in these challenging times in Europe and across the world, where the threats to such freedoms have become increasingly acute. Around this time back in 2023, I found myself aboard a Ukrainian military pickup truck, speeding flat out along rutted roads, leading towards the frontline village of Pervomaiska in Ukraine's fiercely contested eastern Donbass region. There was good reason for our driver's haste, given the ever-present threat of Russian shell fire and drone strikes, the evidence of which lay either side of the road in the skeletal remains of buildings and burnt-out carapaces of Ukrainian tanks and armoured vehicles. Pervomaiska marked then the front line. Beyond that, at the end of the road along which we travelled lay the city of Donetsk, which was occupied and controlled by Russian forces. That very same city that over a decade ago, as pro-Russian separatists began to make their presence felt, I first began to report on Ukraine. Back then, never for a moment could have imagined what the intervening years would bring for Ukraine, Russia, Europe, and indeed the world. War reporting has not stopped the events that have unfolded, but it must not stop trying to by reminding us constantly of the grotesque undertaking that war is. Asked once what he would most like to be were he not a war photographer, the great Robert Capa, one of the finest photojournalists of the 20th century, put it best in a memorable riposte. An unemployed war photographer, Kappa replied. Looking back across Kappa's vast and remarkable body of work, we're probably all familiar with some of the images he made before he was killed after stepping in a landmine in Indochina in 1954. Many were made at the height of Europe's biggest conflicts. Who among us hasn't seen that grainy black and white photograph he took of the famous falling Republican soldier from the Spanish Civil War? Or those he captured amidst the blood and fury of Omaha Beach on D-Day? Kappa, of course, made the ultimate sacrifice for the incredible photographic legacy he left behind, and those within our profession as war reporters sadly continue to do so with shocking frequency. Right now, I think it's fair to say that these are the worst of times and the best of times if you happen to be a journalist. The worst because we're all still reeling from the perfect storm of a structural change brought about by the impact of the internet and the pernicious effect of fake news and alternative facts. The best because we're living through tumultuous world events that more than ever need reporters to bear witness and make sense of them on our behalf. People often ask whether I've grown weary of the war I've witnessed. I know it shows, but the fact that I've not grown weary of reporting or photographing war is perhaps because of one thing above all else. I'm talking here about the remarkable courage and fortitude of those ordinary people I've met along the way, caught up in conflict through no fault of their own. Their generosity and openness in allowing me into their lives, often at dangerous and traumatic moments, is what has kept me going these 40-odd years and reaffirms, frankly, my own faith in humankind's capacity to endure and occasionally overcome. Speaking at an address in 2010 to remember those journalists who gave their lives to report from the conflict zones of the 21st century, the late Marie Colvin described their job as a hard calling. The need for frontline reporting has never been more compelling, she said. Casting an eye across Europe today, and indeed elsewhere in the world, you can't help but think how right Marie Colvin was. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. First of all, can I excuse my voice? I've been developing a cold all day, so I might just stand. It might be easier. No, that's why I'm standing away from you. We have about half an hour almost just under half an hour for questions. We have RSC staff with roving mics. If you do want to ask a question, can I just request that out of respect for the speaker and the audience, you ask a question and not give a speech. So without further ado, we will open up the audience. We do have an online audience as well. But before I ask yourselves, I want to ask you a very quick question, David. Thank you for the presentation. And you finished by saying that you've not grown weary of war reporting. But I wanted to ask you whether you think you might have become desensitized after years of war reporting.
I'd like to think not. I certainly like to think not. I also think that if you do become desensitized and you become used to what you see, then it's pretty much the time to give up the job, to be honest. I think you're turning into something rather robotic and not having that very emotional engagement that I think drives the best reporting, that emotional engagement. I know I've met colleagues who appear desensitized in that way, and I'm sure it impacts negatively on their work. So I'd like to think, and I haven't reached that stage yet.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Questions? Gentleman.
Thank you. Very heartfelt speech. I found myself as an ex-Pirate Radio Caroline DJ and head of programs at Murrayfirth Radio in 1989 1989 in the middle of hundreds of thousands of people in Tiananmen Square in China. It was an amazing, life-changing experience. But what got to me most was when people saw the microphone, they parted and let me through. And many people were saying, please tell the people in your country what is happening here. But they thought the Western journalists were supporting them. And we were not. We were reporting. I ended up then in South Africa, in Afghanistan, and in Kosovo. Kosovo blew my mind, and I spent 3 days crying my eyes out, driving around the M25 when I got home. And I'm glad I went back. But now that USAID is pulling funding, I work with wonderful people in Afghanistan, women, and I am petrified of what can happen to them. Everything we taught them has put their lives in danger. It is wonderful the reporting you do for us, but the difficulty surely is teaching. Every war ends. When it ends, the society has to be rebuilt. And we surely have a duty to teach people how to be objective when the media environment that they have grown up with is not objective. Sorry, it was a bit of a speech.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, I mean, I think one of the things, you're absolutely right about our inability or incapacity to rebuild. If we put a fraction of as much energy into that as we do in prosecuting wars, it would make a tremendous difference. You know, we failed miserably in that respect. Afghanistan is a point in case, obviously. I can think of Libya also, when I covered the Arab Spring uprisings there. You know, we prosecute the wars and then we kind of step back. And lo and behold, bad actors then fill the space that exists because of our failings in that sense. So getting into wars is easy, getting out and an exit strategy is very bad. And invariably, those countries are left high and dry. I mean, Afghanistan is very close to my heart. I mean, people who know me well know that I've spent the bulk of my working life there, going back to the days of the Soviet occupation. And it pains me. It pained me terribly to see what happened after our ignominious withdrawal from that country and leaving them high and dry. So, yes, but as a journalist, my job is to then report on those inadequacies. It's not to rebuild those societies. That task lies with other people.
Thank you, David. Anyone else? The gentleman at the back.
You mentioned Jen Stout, and you're right, everyone should buy a night train to Odessa. What advice would you give to young journalists who are starting out? And for clarity, I am not a young journalist starting out, but I do teach them. So if you, about points about...
But no, that's been very cynical. It's a good question. One I'm often asked by journalism students whenever I talk in journalism courses. And I mean, I know Jen really well, and we have these discussions as well. And I know how passionate she is about her fellow journalists and bringing them on and bringing them through. I think one of the things, I suppose the first piece of advice I would give, particularly if you want to be doing foreign reporting or conflict reporting, is really to steep yourself in the culture and history of those regions or areas that you intend to have as a beat. I think the days of what we used to call in journalism the paratroopers, you know, where you would sort of drop into certain areas that you might not be familiar with politically or culturally, they've kind of gone. I mean, the best reporting, I think, comes from those reporters that have spent a great part of their working lives and getting to know a place, getting beneath the skin of it. You know, I can think of people like Jim Muir, for example, a former BBC reporter in the Middle East who still indeed lives in Beirut and has lived in Beirut throughout the recent conflict there. So my advice, I suppose, would really be get steeped into these countries. If you can, spend time, as I did, as a young journalist, working on English language dailies in certain countries. I worked in Beirut for a while there, but there are many other newspapers around the world. But as I mentioned in my talk, the newspaper landscape is constantly under pressure and beleaguered at the moment. So finding those sort of platforms is very, very difficult. One of my biggest regrets was not actually paying more attention to languages as well, which I should stress is the door opener, I think, for most correspondents rather relying on translators. So first and foremost, perhaps choose a region or area and really that moves you, that you feel impassioned about, and start paying attention to in depth.
Thank you. The lady at the back, and then the lady in the white jumper.
Thank you. I feel like I've jumped the queue because I work for the RSC, but I'm, integrated into the audience. I just want to preface this by saying this is a topic very close to me. I was born in Sarajevo. My family fled that war with 4 suitcases and, settled in Canada. And you talked about the resilience of people that are experiencing war, and I think that's often easy to lose sight of because, in the midst of all that devastation, life has to go on. People still get married, babies are born, all of these milestones still take place. And I guess I'm wondering, how do you make sure you don't overlook those moments of hope and joy and celebration? And how do you capture those and position those alongside that very important documentation that still has to happen?
It's a good question. And I think it's impossible to overlook them because you confront them day in, day out. I mean, war brings out the worst in people, also brings out the absolute best. I mean, it's the one thing that I think helps me and my colleagues get through these kinds of places is the openness, the generosity, the compassion, people taking you into their homes. I mean, you're talking about, the former Yugoslavia, as some people here would deem it. I remember actually during the early stages of the war covering the city of Vukovar at the time when it was under attack, and there was a local mayor in a small town called the Loch, very famous for its white wine. I hasten to add as an aside, apparently Queen Elizabeth's favourite white wine tipple is a Loch wine, but don't take that as root. But a Loch, the people there actually. Basically, we managed to get in. It was besieged at that time, and they took us to their hearts. I mean, they opened up their doors and their homes, and when you see how they're coping with the tremendous pressures day in, day out of getting on with life amidst this horrendous kind of bombardment and what was surrounding them, you can't help but connect with that. I mean, I repeat, if you are desensitized to that, you should not be doing the job, in my opinion. You've lost sight of why you entered journalism in the first place. That is why I went into journalism. It was to engage with people. So I think it's impossible not to overlook that. And again, it's also, as I mentioned in my talk, those journalists that are going now to places and looking at things from a different perspective. They're not just dealing with the geopolitics or the big considerations or the snap news, the breaking news, but actually taking a deep dive into, and I think this is the future for journalism, is this deep dive and getting beneath the surface, the long reads, the documentary films. That is where journalism, I think, has a future. Because, there's a lot of people who say it doesn't have a future. There will always be journalism. It will just be presented in different platforms, different formats, and have different content. And much of that content should be exactly what you're talking about there.
Thank you, David.
Thank you very much for your fascinating presentation and really amazing photos. I'd just like to ask, you're clearly working in very difficult situations and conflict situations. How do you evaluate what's an appropriate risk to take, and have you ever got it wrong?
Yes. To answer your second question first. Well, let me take the evaluation of risk. The industry itself, if I can call it that, has become much more regulated in a way. I mean, I spent nearly 3-4 decades covering conflicts before I ever underwent a hostile environment training course. The only reason I embarked upon that, it was because it was a protocol or legal prerequisite in order to do work for the BBC. I could not work, even though I'd worked for 40 years in conflict zones, I still had to undergo a hostile environment training course in order to make a BBC documentary. And indeed, when I went down to that course, in which is always run by these ex-special forces chappies and, in strange places and whatever, and many of them said I'd probably, and indeed many of the journalists on the course with me had probably encountered more conflict than many of them had as soldiers in that way. Evaluating the risk, it's a tricky one. Experience comes into it. When I look back to my early years as a young correspondent, I would never in a million years take the chances now that I did then, you know. I'd like to think I'm older and wiser in that way. But, you know, when you're that age, you're indestructible. Nothing can happen to you, you know, you're gung-ho. And that, tragically, I think, is where so many young journalists lose their lives. And, you know, the landscape is inhabited by freelancers now. There's virtually no one, even if you read a regular byline in a newspaper, they may be regulars to that newspaper, but invariably they're freelancers on freelance contracts. So they're kind of trapezing without a safety net a little bit financially. And it's admittedly the industry now pays more attention to the hostile environment training. Making that evaluation is something you do on the ground and you learn with experience. And you hope that by the time you survive long enough to learn the on-the-job tricks, if you like, before you make that fatal mistake. As for making that mistake, yes, I made a mistake once which cost me dearly when I, shall we say, succumbed to an invitation from certain militiamen in Croatia. I say militiamen reservedly because it was towards the end of the war in the former Yugoslavia, down near a place called Chitluk near Mostar. And in fact, they were just simply gangsters, and I misjudged their motives. And I ended up in a very, very traumatic situation for which I'm very, very fortunate to be here right now. It was something that physically damaged me and psychologically damaged me for quite a long time. And it was a mistake. I look back on it, and it was a misjudgment. But I was under pressure to get access to a front line. I thought they could enable me to do that, and they simply turned on a sixpence, and I fully regret that. But I got away with it, just. And it's very easy. Such is the fine line if you get it right or you get it wrong.
Thank you, David. There's a question online.
So we have a question from Kat. How do you manage to stay detached, do your job, and not feel like you have to help the people you report on, like give them your food or help them leave?
With difficulty. I have to remind myself that I'm not a doctor, I'm not an aid worker, I'm not a paramedic, I'm a journalist. I best serve the people in these circumstances by doing what I do best, I think, is reporting their circumstances and making the wider world aware of what they are undergoing. Now, that's not to say that I haven't and my colleagues haven't on occasions help people in some way, whether it be carrying someone, moving a wounded person, or whatever. But, you know, as any photographer, and, you know, we have Stuart Atwood here, and Stuart and I have travelled the world together, and he'll know exactly what I'm talking about here, you know. And, you know, that moment where do you take that photograph, it could be just 1,000th of a second of a difference in the decision making. You take the photograph, then help the person, or you help the person, then you miss the photograph, you know. And that might sound like a very selfish thing to say, but my job is to be there to document what is going on. And I cannot become embroiled, overly embroiled in helping people to that extent. It often puts the lives, my own life in jeopardy. It puts the lives of my colleagues, if you're working as a television crew, for example, possibly in danger as well. But that's not to say that we've never stepped up to the plate and helped people in certain circumstances, given them food, tried to do what you can, but you have to draw a line at that. You can't help everyone in these circumstances. I'd like to think that what I do, you know, can help in a wider way. I mean, I'm just thinking actually with Stuart standing there. I remember a photograph that you took actually, I think, in Afghanistan when we were there once, and it was a little boy who was suffering. He had cataracts. Had a problem that could be medically solved quite easily. And the photograph was published, went worldwide, and a very, very generous donor stepped up, realizing that a simple operation could make sure that this little boy would not be blinded for life, and actually put forward a very substantial chunk of money to this particular NGO, which enabled countless other children to have that operation. So that one photograph taken made such a difference to the lives of so many, rather than those individual interventions, I think, that can be very, very limiting.
Thank you, David. The gentleman there, and then the lady, oh, sorry, the lady in the red jacket here.
Hello. Yeah. It's one of these things, it might sound a bit kind of stupid, I don't want to ask this question, but just by in asking the question, I don't want to present the wrong sort of image. But there's a friend of mine has a Ukrainian refugee, and when she came over 3 years ago, so she's in her 30s, and she had a young child here. But her mother came over just about 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I was asking my friend, I said, well, how does she think about the thing? And I think she must stay near the front line sort of idea. So the woman maybe is in her maybe 60s, 70s sort of idea. And I was just wondering if it's an age thing, but it was almost that the feeling was that she was more happy for the thing to be resolved irrespective of who won, almost accepting to some extent if the Russians win, it'll be all right, because if I get peace, it'll be all right type of idea. Now, I don't know if that's pervasive, that was an individual thing, so that was why I'm concerned in asking the question. I don't want to present the wrong picture, but I was actually surprised that that was an attitude. Is it an attitude of some people? Is how pervasive was that? Or is it just, was this just a unique circumstance?
It's a good question. I don't think it's pervasive generally in Ukraine. I think there is still a determination. The country, after nearly, going on 4 years of war now, and of course it's beleaguered, of course it's exhausted, of course people are tired of war and frustrated. Inevitably there will be those people who would be more willing to make concessions, whether it be ceding territory or giving something away in order to bring back a modicum of peace. But I don't think most Ukrainians are under any illusions as to what Vladimir Putin's and the Kremlin's long-term aims are. And they know that if they don't get a resolution of a real sort on this occasion, that possibly they will have to revisit war again in the future. So it's important to them, and they recognize that. But I accept what you're saying. And when you talk to people in the country, you know, every time I go back, I notice it more and more. I mean, we were talking about this earlier on, that, you know, one of the things that I notice when I go back to Kiev, where you can sit in a cafe and it looks as though nothing is wrong until the air raid siren goes off and drones fly overhead. One of the things I have noticed is more and more limbless people, you know, the people physically maimed by the war. And that maiming also happens at a collective level, I think, psychologically, and wears people down. But I don't think Ukrainians are ready to peace at any price. I think we're a long way from that position. We would all welcome peace. I mean, if you look at today's news alone, I mean, with the ongoing talks, much as the progress is slow, and they're talking about, you know, the Black Sea opening up again, every step in the right direction towards peace, and at least getting people around the table talking is vitally important. But I don't think Ukrainians are fooled into the idea that they're ready to give or to cede territory or this or that in order to gain peace. So I don't think it's as pervasive as you might think.
Thank you, David. The lady in the red jacket, and then the lady over there.
You've made it very clear how dangerous your hard calling is. How and where do you get the inner fortitude to keep going back?
I drink. No. I don't know. I mean, I enjoy what I do, I suppose, is the simple answer. And enjoy is maybe not the right word, but, you know, I feel committed and, you know, as passionate about it. I mean, I've just come back from Nepal. I've made 2 trips to Nepal in the last month, where I'm working on a short documentary film. It's a non-conflict environment. And goodness me, what a pleasure, even though some of the subject matter was quite bleak in terms of poverty and whatever. But, you know, what a fantastic opportunity to work in a non-conflict environment and go about the reporter's task without fearing of being shot or shelled or whatever. And that reminded me of why I enjoy the job so much, that engagement with my fellow human beings, no matter where they are. I mean, my job's enabled me to visit corners of the world that very, very few people will ever visit, whether it be in peacetime or in conflict. And if there's an inner fortitude, as you describe it, I think it's because of the pleasure that I get from engaging with people. And as long as I'm able to do that, albeit quite often those people are in extremis or in desperate situations, then I think that fuels the commitment to the job in a way and keeps you ticking over. That's not to say that occasionally, you feel a bit down about, the state of the world or the way the world is shaping up, particularly at the moment. I think we live in incredibly dangerous times. I'm not quite sure many people actually realise how dangerous. I mentioned the murmurings, and be it in caves and deserts of Afghanistan or Iraq or in the back streets of Donetsk, but those murmurings are quite sinister right now. I really genuinely believe that. And it's imperative that we are all aware and awake to the threat that this poses to Europe, to the world at this precise moment, And again, that's re-energized me. That helps fuel that fortitude, because I think it's important to get that message out there.
Thank you, Dave. Maybe we can have the last two questions
Online.
together. So there's one online, and then the lady at the front here.
So we've got a question from Martin, who's asked, do you feel there is a danger to press freedom in the UK, Scotland and Europe?
Could you repeat that, please?
Do you feel that there is a danger to press freedom in the UK, Scotland and Europe?
Yes. There's a danger to press freedom everywhere right now. If anything's pervasive, it's the danger to press freedom right now. It's like a cancer, that's growing, and it's alarming to see certain countries that you think, well, that wouldn't happen here, beginning to go down some rather strange and worrying routes in that way. And that's why I think it's imperative, whether it be right here on our doorstep or whether it be in far-flung parts of the world, that we keep on top of that. If we do not have that press freedom, and it is worrying. I mean, we're all familiar with the online kind of landscape at the moment, and the effects of disinformation and fake news, and frankly, downright propaganda being pushed and fed by some very, very powerful people right now. All the more reason why we need to make sure that we have a functioning, free press, both here. And let's be under no illusions, just because we don't live in Vladimir Putin's Russia doesn't mean to say that press freedom is exactly in clear blue water here. It's anything but. We cannot take it for granted. We must stay on top of it. So the short answer is yes, I do think there's a threat, but it's up to us to make sure that it doesn't become an unworkable situation where our press is suddenly gone and we don't have those independent voices and eyes and ears.
Please, go ahead.
Thank you very much. You used the phrase a moment ago about peace at any price. During war and conflict, and when you're involved in that personally, there is a resilience at a certain stage that keeps you going. I know that for a fact. But towards the end, if someone's coming along mightier than you and imposing a peace, that is not a peace in reality.
Absolutely.
I'm thinking of Ukraine, and I'm also thinking of Gaza. You can stop a war, but you cannot kill an ideology, nor can you kill off the desire for freedom and independence. Therefore, do you have an opinion about Trump, Putin?
Not that I can, not that I can say publicly, I suspect.
Well, my question was going to be the emergence of Trump, Putin, and China, and the arc of influence that they appear to be having now and in the future. Is everything going to be controlled by trade? Will that cease conflict? What do you think in that area?
Well, I think you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, I mentioned the dangerous times in which we live, and there is that breakdown in the international rules, order as we know, and people like Trump, Putin, the strong men. I hate that term, but you know what I mean by that. Recently, we've just seen it in Turkey with Erdogan. Again, it's happening everywhere. There is this cult of the strong person again, and the whole world order is being reshuffled in a way that I think we need to be very, very alert to. I mean, Trump is just simply a very dangerous individual. And I also see the whole dimension, because he sees things, in my opinion, through a kind of business lens, a business prism. That in itself, I think, is a very incendiary commodity. I mean, if you look at the way even his response to Gaza, he sees it as like a large condominium on the coast. Everything is seen through that prism. Everywhere you look in the world right now, this battle for resources. Look at Rwanda, Congo. Congo is a country that I've visited many, many times, and it's got vast natural resources that the modern digital age needs, for batteries, for mobile devices or whatever. And we're going to be seeing more and more of that. And I think these individuals, these strong men, and that reshuffling and breakdown of the rules-based order internationally is moving apace at the moment, and I don't really see anything to check it. There's nothing there checking it as such, and that is a real cause for concern. I mean, that's why I hate to be, they don't call me the international man of misery for nothing, but I have been dubbed that quite often, but that's the reality of the world we're living in right now, and these are unprecedented times. I'm well into my 60s now, and I think back to early childhood experiences. I'm just old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, for example, of 62, 63, and the world on tenterhooks at that time because of what was happening at that particular moment. My goodness, we're in a far more dangerous place right now, arguably, than we were in 1962 or 63, simply because everything's collapsed. There are no kind of obvious blocks through. It's oligarch country. It's rogue. It's loose cannon country that we're in now, politically and economically, and that is a very, very incendiary and combustible combination, I think.
I know there are lots more questions, but I'm afraid our time has come to an end. Can I just finish the evening by saying to you, David, first of all, thank you for making the time, especially as you have just recently returned from Nepal. Thank you for your considered reflections, your honesty. We're really pleased, I think I can say on behalf of everyone, that you are still here with us. And we wish you many years of reporting around the world. And I think conflict is part of the human condition. None of us want war, but where there is war, we do want journalism to shed a light on it. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in thanking David Pratt for his 2025 McCormick Lecture.